Hi everyone, thanks so much for listening to another episode of Dogman Encounters Radio. I'm Vic Cundiff and I'll be your host for the show. Before we bring on tonight's guest, if you've had a Dogman encounter and would like to speak with me about it, whether in private or on the show, please go to dogmanencounters.com and submit a report. I'd love to hear from you. If you've had a Sasquatch sighting and would like to be a guest on Bigfoot Eyewitness Radio, please go to bigfooteyewitness.com and submit a report. All right, let's bring on tonight's guest. Tonight's guest is Trinity. Trinity, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Vic. I'm glad to be on.
Oh, thanks for coming on. We appreciate your time. Trinity, please give us a brief bio on yourself.
Okay. I'm a 26-year-old contractor. I live in southern Tennessee. I'm a musician, and I live on approximately 55 acres. Moved down here about 4 years ago. Previously was traveling kind of all over for work. I spent some time in California and out west. And for the last 4 years, this has been home for me.
Well, it sounds like you've carved out a really nice life for yourself.
Yeah, I like to think so.
I'd say you have. What were your thoughts on the possibility that cryptids like Sasquatch and Dogman existed before you had your encounter?
Well, I grew up hearing tales from, the older generations in my family, most of which are predominantly native. And, I just assumed that they were stories. I always entertained the idea that they could be out there, and it always, interested me. But I was more into the idea that there was something extraterrestrial in space rather than, something actually walking among us.
Yeah, that doesn't make you any different than a lot of other people.
Yeah. I was never really a naysayer. I just, I was more intrigued by the idea than actually, going out and trying to find one or, watching those shows about people finding one or anything like that.
Oh, no, I understand. I do understand. How many people have you shared your encounter with, and how did they respond when you told them?
This is my first experience sharing this event in its entirety. Certain parts of it I've told to my mom and dad, and, my brother was there to witness certain parts with me, but they were not receptive at all. They thought I was crazy.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. Doesn't surprise me, that's the way it normally goes, but yeah, that is unfortunate. From what I understand, before you had your Dogman encounter, you spent time looking for Sasquatch with your grandfather. What more can you tell us about that?
Absolutely I did. I spent quite a few summers all over Northern California, Oregon, and some southern parts of Alaska. He is pretty avid in that, and I would accompany him, whenever I was off work or out of school, whenever I was in school. But yeah, I actually enjoyed all of that. I loved spending time with him in the woods, and for me, that's pretty much what it was just spending times with my grandfather in the woods and listening to the stories he would tell about what we were actually looking for.
Did you ever find any Sasquatch?
No, we did not. He says that he has seen one on several different occasions, or heard one in close proximity, and he's even got a few photos that, he would show me on multiple occasions, but whenever I was looking at the photos, it more or less just looked like bushes and trees in the middle of nowhere. I couldn't really distinguish what he had seen when he was actually there taking the photo.
Yeah, that's the way it normally works. A lot of the pictures that I receive, the people who sent them, they believe wholeheartedly that there are dogmen in those pictures, but yeah, most of the time I just don't really see anything, so I know what that's like. You describe your property as being a slice of heaven. Since your encounter happened so close to it, please tell us about the area where you live.
The area where I live is beautiful, and that's really the only way I can describe it. I mean, there's no city lights. around. The nearest town is maybe 15 miles away, and it's not a big town, so there's not a whole lot of light radiating off of it. But, you step outside, you can see every star across the sky. You can see for miles. We're on top of a hill with valleys all around us. And so, we get a lot of thunderstorms, but it's more of they go right around our property. Our property is right at the top of this hill, and we are the highest point for as far as you can see. So fortunately, there's been several tornadoes and everything like that, but they've gone right around us. And the fields are I've never seen greener fields. Even whenever they're dead, in the winter months or in the fall months, they're still the most beautiful fields I've ever seen. In the summertime, it looks like golf course, just beautiful green. And I mean, even the trees surrounding the fields, there's never any debris or anything, blurring the lines. It's straightforward. I can mow right up to the woods, and it's just a clear cut border between the trees and the fields. So it really is heaven, Vic.
Yeah, it does sound like a slice of heaven. Wow, sounds like a really nice place. All right, Trinity, please tell us about your encounter now. Give us every last detail that comes to mind.
Okay. Well, summertimes, my brother and I pretty much live in the back of the property. Now, the way our property is set up is we have a huge field that the house sits near the back of, and then maybe 200 yards to the south, there is a tree line that dips way down into the woods, and it's the same with the west and the east and the north of us. It's all surrounded by woods that shoots straight down. The incline is pretty steep. Unless you were familiar with walking on terrain like that, it would not be a good terrain to walk on. There's a lot of cliffside and caves and waterfalls and such, and creeks and ravines, and rocks. We have a lot of trees blow over constantly because the ground is so rocky here that the roots don't grow down, they grow more outward. So whenever a large tree blows over, it might only have 10 or so inches of root biting into the ground because they hit the rocks and go outward. So there's constantly dead leaves on top of rocks that, you're constantly sliding going down these hills. Now, across the backyard, down to the wood line, it drops down maybe 100 yards or so to a creek, and then it comes back up the same distance up to the backfield. The backfield is maybe 80 yards wide to the next set of woods, but it's really long. I would say maybe 600 yards wide. Then that drops down another ravine, and that's where the caves are, and that's where the cliffs are, and that's where the bowl is. It makes a big bowl formation, and that's where it's got the waterfalls around all sides, and there's a little peninsula with trees growing in the center of where the waterfalls come in and make two rivers or creeks. They go around this peninsula. And right around there is how we distinguish where we are in the property. We always kind of reference ourselves whenever we go, because around the property itself is nothing but woodland. No houses, no fields. It's just all woods for a very long time. So we kind of use that bowl as a reference point, and we rarely ever go too much further than the bowl because there's really no sense to it. It's just more treacherous, more snakes, more, everything that you don't really want to have to deal with. So this begins about late summer of last year. Just like every summer previously, my brother and I had been, out in the backfield, just on the edge of the woods line towards the furthest backmost part of the property. And we'd set up our tents, we'd set up our hammocks, we'd have fire, we'd, drink beer, listen to the radio and all that and get ready for muscadine season, which muscadines typically start coming in towards fall. So as soon as the muscadines started coming in, we started grabbing as many as we could. We went around the tree lines. We got a bunch. We got probably 30 gallons of muscadines. And right around the middle of September, we started running out of muscadines. So we started venturing, of course, deeper into the woods because there were these vines high up in the trees that, you would see muscadines on. So we found a big cluster, and we were a good ways from the bowl. I would say we were a quarter mile past the bowl, which at the time was not the furthest I'd ever been, but it was right around the furthest I'd ever been. And we found a big cluster of muscadines. So we had our rifles. There's no way that either one of us is climbing this tree. Now, we both can climb trees, but, these were pretty high up. So we took our rifles and we started shooting, and, we hit a few branches, hit a few vines, and got a fairly decent amount of this muscadine cluster down. But, we wanted all of them. It was probably the last big bunch that we were going to find, so we were trying to get all of them. So we started throwing rocks. My brother is pretty built. He played football, as did I in high school. We got arms on us. We could throw a rock pretty far. We were grabbing rocks about the size of baseballs, I would say, thereabouts, and we were throwing them almost straight up, but we moved back a little bit so we didn't have to throw at such a steep angle. And we did hit quite a few muscadines, and they all fell in the tarp. But there was just this other cluster that neither one of us could seem to reach, and it turned quickly, as most things do between brothers, into a competition. We started poking at one another. Oh, you can't throw as far as I can. You can't throw like me, and I'll show you how it's done type of thing. So that led into a who can throw a rock the farthest competition. Now, we were just below these cliff areas, and from where we were standing, it was still a good 80, 100 yards, maybe 110. It was hard to determine because we could not see the creek, so I have no real way of referencing exactly how far we were from the creek, but I knew we were still a ways because when you look down towards where the creek should be, you could see tree tops, and some of these trees are 60, 70 feet tall. So I knew we were a good ways from the creek still. And we started throwing them, trying to throw above and beyond the creek and trying to hit different trees that we had targeted on the other side of this ravine. So we are throwing with all our might, and we are not getting it. You can hear them hitting the tops of the trees and going right down and hitting the large pieces of slate rock that line the creek. And we're not meeting our mark. We're pretty tired at this point. It's muggy. It's hot. We've been at it all day. The sun is about to go down. So we, kind of just knock it off, and we sit down, take a little break, take a little drink of some water and light up a cigarette or something. And that's whenever we started hearing like a knocking noise that sounded almost identical to the sound of somebody chopping wood. And that's what we initially first thought, was it was the neighbor chopping wood. But I soon realized how far away we were from our own property and how far away we were from the neighbor and his property. And that's really the only two properties are to the left and right of the house. There's nothing behind us. It is nothing but woods. There's a road that separates the woods, and on the other side of the road, it is just more and more woods. I mean, it goes on and on and on. So I rather, immediately realized that it is not the neighbor chopping wood, and I get this, it's hard to describe the feeling I got. It's like your heart in your throat kind of feeling, because you realize that it's not your neighbor making this noise. Then I thought, well, maybe there was some kids, messing with us, but the noises kept getting closer and closer. And that's when I realized that something was hitting the trees, like a woodpecker, but way too slow to be a woodpecker. So then my next thought was, okay, well, the neighbor is a hunter, so maybe he's venturing as far back as we are, clearing out a spot with a hatchet to put a deer blind or something, maybe. But right around the time I had that thought, we heard one about 60 feet from us, and I heard something hit the ground. So we immediately went to the direction where I had heard it, and that's when I saw a stone from the creek. It was most definitely, without a shadow of a doubt, a stone from the creek. And it was large, very large. Not extremely large, but bigger than a rock that I would throw. And I just kind of looked up at the tree that I knew I'd heard it hit, and right about 20, 30, I don't know, maybe even 35 feet up this tree, there was a serious gouge where this rock had struck that tree. And that's whenever my heart sank out of my throat into my feet, pretty much. And I was flooded with all of these conversations I'd had with my grandfather, saying that Bigfoot throws rocks. And I just connected the dots, and I knew without a shadow of a doubt that it was a Bigfoot. Because, we had been throwing rocks, and then all of a sudden, from the same direction we were throwing rocks, something was throwing much bigger rocks back in our direction. And by this point, the sun was at the top of the trees, and I knew that we were not going to make it up before dark. So I told my brother, I said, this is a Bigfoot. Look at this rock it just threw. That's where it hit. We need to go. And he immediately made me feel like the biggest idiot. He was like, oh, you such and such, you pansy, you this and that. He was like, yeah, we better go before a skinwalker shows up, or a giant, or, and he listed off a few other. He was mocking me the whole time. And I said, no, I'm going. You can stay here, but I'm leaving. So I started walking up, and he, started walking with me. And the whole time I just felt different. I felt 100% different from the time I walked into the woods. And it wasn't so much that I'd heard a noise that I couldn't explain. I felt there was a shift. There was an obvious shift. Something knew exactly where I was. And nobody knew where I was. I was in the woods. That's where I thrive. That's where I spent a good chunk of my life, is in the woods. And that's home for me. Nobody knows where I'm at in the woods. That's my one place that I can get away. And somebody knew where I was. And I honestly felt like they were watching, possibly even following. Now, I never heard any kind of sticks break or leaves or any kind of rock slides or anything like that. So I can't say that something was watching me. I can't say for sure that something was following us, but I felt it. I'm pretty well in tune with just feelings. I'm in touch with vibes and everything of that nature. I can sense when something is different. I can sense whenever something isn't right. So we haul butt up to the top, finally make it. It's dark at this point, and I get into the truck. The feeling doesn't go away until we go across the backfield, down the first set of woods, up the first set of woods, and into the backyard. Once I'm in the backyard, I can't even see the house at this point, but something completely changes. Like, there was enough distance between us and whatever just happened that I felt okay. But that soon would change, because over the course of the next couple weeks, it got worse and worse feeling. The range of the feeling, it wasn't just the backwoods anymore. It wasn't just the backfield anymore. I started to feel that way, when I was down at the pond, which is towards the front of the property, closest to the road. I started to feel that way at the neighbor's house towards that side of the woods. I started to feel that way anytime I was within 50 yards or so of a tree line. I started to feel that twisted feeling of, there is something just on the other side of that tree line that is watching you, that knows exactly what you're doing at this moment. And that feeling did not let up. It got to the point that we've got a burn barrel that's maybe 40 feet off the back of the house, a good ways from any kind of wood line. And trash often fell on me. We'd burn cardboard and, things that could burn. And that was my duty. I'd go out at night and, I'd put my headphones in and walk out with the dogs, and burn trash. And it got to where I didn't want to go out and burn trash, even at, sunset, where you could still see. I did not want to go outside. And it really started to affect me whenever I noticed the dogs acting kind of the same way. Now, we have 5 dogs, and my sister has 2 dogs here, sometimes 3 dogs here. So we've got, at any given time, between 5 and 8 dogs here. And they're all pretty good size. The smallest one is about 60 pounds, and that's my blue heeler, and he's the smartest one of all. He was right there with me. I could tell he didn't want to come out. I could tell there was just something not right. And as soon as I started reading the body language of the dogs, I realized that I was not crazy. I was not overthinking this. I was not overreacting. So at that point, I started bringing the dogs. Well, the dogs sleep inside every night. But there's a lot of nights where, they'll take off after a deer, or they'll take off after a pack of coyotes, or they will take off after armadillos. We have a lot of armadillos around the property, and I go out every night to the back field, and we make our sweeps, and I run the dogs after armadillos, and it's good exercise for them. Of course, they don't usually catch them, but it keeps them pretty well ran off the property, so we don't have to worry about holes or them digging up the garden or anything like that. But they, a lot of times, like 2 or 3, 4 times a week, would take off running in the middle of the night after a noise and be gone till morning. So, they weren't really doing that. I didn't really give them the opportunity, because as soon as they started acting funny, I didn't want to take any chances on them not coming home. So I would start taking them out 2 at a time, 1 at a time, mad max 3 at a time, just depending on which dogs I had with me. But other than that weird feeling, everything was pretty quiet for the next few nights, maybe a week, maybe a week and a half, maybe 2 weeks. And then I woke up one night, and it wasn't the noise that woke me up, but I had woken up for some reason. I'd rolled over and checked my notifications and was scrolling on my phone, and that's when I heard the sound of, it sounded like a screen door slamming shut with the wind, but I could immediately tell it wasn't connected to the house. It was off in the distance. So I was, my ears perked up, and I thought, I'll go out on the back porch and, let a dog out and, smoke a cigarette and see if I can see what this noise is. And, as I'm walking through the kitchen, I hear it again, slam, slam, slam. And I kind of put it together that it's the shed. We've got this hay shed that we use for hay, but I could definitely tell that whoever cleared this property out and built on this property had used it for horses. It's just a 2x4 structure with tin roof, and the same material that's making up the roof is the siding. And there's like a trough in there that's old, and we use it for hay and fencing and stuff. So during the last storm, I had realized that the wind was making the corner of one of the sides of the roof slam. It was picking it up and it was slamming that tin on the 2x4 frame. And I was like, well, I just, didn't get around to nailing that down like I did the rest of it. That's what it is. But, I was already downstairs, so I thought I'd let Willie outside and I would go out and have a cigarette, maybe do some more scrolling and just kind of see. Now, we've got a big tree house that we've built that's about the same size as our rear deck, maybe a little bigger. And there's a rope bridge that walks out to it. And we got a little table out there with some chairs. So that's where I was sitting. And I went out there and I was scrolling on Facebook, and all of a sudden I started hearing it again, but I didn't really pay too much attention because at this point I thought it was just the wind slamming that thing. It wasn't until a few slams in that I realized that the wind was not blowing. And that's whenever I dimmed the screen on my phone, and slowly I got that feeling in my chest again. And I slowly turned my head and looked out in the direction of the shed. Now, the moon was so bright this night. It wasn't exactly a full moon, but it was close. And I saw what looked like bats or birds swooping down and hitting the top and hitting the sides of the shed. And it was really strange to me. But as I kind of looked more, I realized that they weren't birds, and I kind of realized that they were more than likely rocks being thrown once again from down at the creek, only this time it was the creek behind the house and not the creek on the other side of the back field, which is pretty close to the same distance, I would say. We got about 100 yards from the creek to the wood line, and then maybe another 40, 50 yards to the shed. So anyway, the shed is a good distance away from the house. I think I've already said, but it's a couple 100 yards, 100, 150, 200, somewhere in there. It's far. But the next day, I go out and I investigate, and I see all of these stones, half the size of my head. Some of them were like grapefruits, some of them were like softballs, some of them were like helmets. And they were all around the back of the shed. And there was these huge dents in the sides and in the roof of this hay shed and the tin siding that looked like it would if I were to, like if some WWF stars were to come out and start body slamming people's heads into this. It was head shaped. It looked massive dents. And that's whenever I knew for sure that it was a Bigfoot. Because what else could throw these rocks of this size, that distance, with that much force? To even make it there would be something I couldn't do with, a baseball-sized rock, let alone the size of the rocks that they were throwing. And the impact was just so hard that I could hear it from in the house upstairs. And to leave dents like that is just unreal. So I remember my grandfather, when we were out in Northern California, anytime he would sense anything in the woods, anytime he would feel the presence of a Bigfoot, or he would see a sign, or he would hear something in the night, or, a lot of times he would put audio recorders out all night, and he would come back and he would listen to the recordings. And anytime he got any kind of hint that there might be some activity in the area, he would put these big red apples into the treetops, maybe 7 to 12 feet high. He would climb up into the branches and just set them. It was like a peace offering, and that's pretty much what he had called it. I don't exactly remember the exact word because I'm not so well versed in the native tongue anymore, but that's what it translated to as a peace offering. So that's what I did. I went to the store. I got a big bag of Granny Smith, huge red apples. I went to the shed and I walked straight back into the woods. Now, about halfway between the wood line and the creek, there is this giant tree that has all kinds of branches going every which way, and it's dead, so there's never any leaves on it. My son calls it the octopus tree. And I took every apple out of that bag and placed them in different branches between 7 and 12 feet in this tree. And I just kind of looked around, and I still seriously felt that feeling of I wasn't alone in the woods. And it really bothered me. That feeling really bothers me because I've lived my entire life since I was a young boy knowing full well that there is nothing in those woods that's badder than I am. I've had my tussles with coyotes. I've had my tussles with bobcats. There's nothing in that woods that I can't handle. So this feeling was a feeling I've never felt before, and it made me extremely uncomfortable. So after I placed the apples, I didn't waste any time getting out of the woods, and got in the Jeep, drove back to the house, got myself ready for work, and headed into work. Now, while I was at work, there was a pretty bad storm that came through. It uprooted a few of our trees. There was a lot of debris around. The neighbor's chicken coop was destroyed. The roof on the rabbit cages was ripped off. A few miles down the road, there was a trailer that had its roof ripped off. It was just a lot of destruction. It was high winds, really, really hard rain. You couldn't hardly see anything in this rain. It was a downpour. And when I got off work, it was around midnight. I worked late that night. And so by the time I was heading down the main road, it was probably approximately 1:15 in the morning. And there was a lot of fog, a lot of fog that night. But the moon was shining bright. The clouds had cleared out. The moon was shining bright, but there was a lot of fog. And it wasn't like a dense fog. It was more of the kind of fog that you drive through a foggy bit and then it's super clear, and then another wisp of fog and then it's clear. You just drive through sections of fog. And so it's about 10 miles down this main road that go in between the two towns. But then you have to take a left, and you go a couple miles down this other road, and then there's another turn, my road, that is very narrow, very windy, very up and down as you come to the top of this hill. We don't really call them mountains here in southern Tennessee because we know that it isn't really a mountain, in comparison to the east side of the state, or, like Blue Ridge, or like, Appalachia. It's not mountains like that. It's just really, really, really tall hills. So the road winds, and it's very narrow and very treacherous, especially when it's foggy. And if there's another car coming, somebody has to pull over and the other guy has to go. So I was driving up this, and I turned off the main road, turned off of the other road, and I was onto this narrow road. and I was winding and curving and weaving and kind of taking my time because the fog was kind of in and out, and the headlights on my Jeep weren't so good. So about a half a mile from my property, there is a cattle farmer on the opposite side of the road, and he's got nothing but fields. The whole area up and down this road is so densely wooded, but this was a giant open field, and he has a wooden fence with, cattle wire and barbed wire on top, but the fence is probably about 4 foot tall and just a few feet off of the road. And you drive straight towards it before you make this curve off to the left to kind of get away from it and make the other few turns to get up to the property. Well, as I was rounding this curve to get to where I was facing this fence, something kind of caught my eye through the fog, and it looked like a folded up trampoline canvas, the big brown black part of a trampoline, or maybe a tarp, or just a huge chunk of debris that was laying over this fence. And, we had a bad storm, and there was a few trees that I had to kind of drive around on this road. So I thought, somebody had just lost a tarp, or somebody had lost a trampoline, something. Somebody had lost something, and it got hung up on this fence. Well, as soon as I made the final turn and was facing the fence directly, is right around the same time that I could see through the fog. The fog was still in front of me, but I could see through it. And that's when I saw these two, they look like the reflectors off of a mailbox, those round reflectors. And that really stuck out to me because I knew there was no reflectors on this fence, and I knew there was no mailbox in that area. And as soon as the wisp of fog cleared my windshield, it was bright under that moonlight. It was vibrant under that moonlight. And I saw in detail that those reflectors were eyes. I could see pupils. I could see eyes. I could see eyelids. And the Jeep just kind of came to a stop. And that's whenever I put together that the large black mass that I thought was hanging on this fence was actually this thing that was crouched in front of the fence. And that's when I saw the ears, and that's when I saw the nose, and that's when I saw the shoulders, and that's when I froze. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I couldn't think to scream. I could not think. I was frozen exactly where I was. And it seemed like I made eye contact with this thing for a good long while, even though I'm very sure it was not long at all. And he wasn't looking at my Jeep. He wasn't looking at this big object that was winding down the road. He was looking right through the windshield, directly into my eyes. It was full on eye contact. And then he stood up. Now, when he was crouched there, I was able to tell that he was about a foot taller than that fence, in like a hunched over. He wasn't really sitting. It was a hunched position. Then he stood up, and he was well bigger than that fence. I would say at least twice the size of that fence, maybe a little less, maybe a little more. But the shoulders and the face are what really stuck out to me, because I could not bring my attention off of his face, but I could definitely see his shoulders. I could see his chest. I mean, I could see all of them in my peripheral, but that's what I was drawn to. I could not get my eyes off of his face. And I saw his body language. It was not aggressive. His ears weren't pinned back. His stance was not in a forward stance. It was completely like he was just standing there. He never made a step towards me. He never acted like he was about to make a step towards me. He never pinned his ears back. His eyes did get a little bit narrow, but it wasn't in like an aggressive way. And then his lips peeled back, and I saw all of his teeth. And it was not like a snarl, but definitely more like a smile. And I realized then that in his hand, he was holding one of those red apples. And his hands weren't like normal hands. I didn't really spend too much time looking at them, but they were not normal hands. They weren't. It was like something you would see in a movie or something you would see on the internet, like one of those pictures or videos that everybody assumes is a hoax, but I was staring straight into obviously not a hoax. So as soon as I saw the apple and the face that he was making as he was looking straight through my windshield at me, I immediately dropped the clutch, put my foot to the floor, and at first I thought I had made a mistake because it seemed like an eternity that my wheels just sat there spinning. And, the road was very wet, and I just floored it. And I finally got some traction, and I was whipping up this road faster than I've ever gone. And I was actually concerned that I might, run off the road. And then I knew if that happened that I was not going to be in a good spot, because I was in my Jeep with no top, no doors. So I just booked it home. I got home as fast as I could. And the whole time I was staring in my rearview mirror, expecting to see this thing running after me or, something else like that, or getting ready to jump into the back of the Jeep or something, but it never did. It was gone. As soon as I looked back the first time and I saw it around the curve, that's the last time I saw it. So I got home, I drove past the driveway, through the yard, right up to the steps of the porch, and that's where I got out. I walked straight inside, I locked both the doors, I went straight upstairs with all the dogs where my son was sleeping, and I did not sleep a wink that entire night. I didn't want to turn any lights on because I was afraid that it would have followed me home. And I mean, this thing was obviously canine, so I knew that it wouldn't matter one way or another if the lights were on or not. But my method of thinking was, I've at least got a chance if it's just as dark out here as it is in there, because my eyes would be adjusted. And I didn't sleep at all. I sat there on the bed with the AR-15 and the dogs. Now, the dogs never even lifted an ear. They didn't sense anything. I mean, my dog, Willie, was at my feet. He's usually my shadow. He stays right with me 24/7. I can't get rid of the guy. And tonight was no different. He was under my feet. But I could tell that he could tell that I was a little messed up. But as far as anything else, there was no noises outside. There was no anything. And I just made my rounds. I didn't put the gun down. I went window to window, just, checking all night. And the dogs never gave me any sign that anything was out there. And other than being a wreck from what I had just seen, there was really no indication that anything was wrong outside. I knew very well that this thing was what was responsible for the rocks, the feeling I had in the woods, everything. So I knew that this thing was on my property. I knew this thing likely followed us from off the property. And I knew that was it. I knew that what I saw was what I had been experiencing for the last few weeks. So the next day, the sun came up. I waited a good hour after the sun came up to go outside, and I pretty much did a perimeter check. I had the rifle with me. I had my pistol with me. And at this time, I had the 308, the AR-10, and I walked the woods line, and I looked for anything, any sign of this thing that I could. But I still kind of kept my distance. You know, it was fall-ish time, but there was still a lot of foliage on the trees, so you couldn't see very far into the woods unless you were just inside the tree line. From the field, you can't see more than 10 feet into the woods. But if you're just inside the wood line, you could see all the way down, but that was so uncomfortable for me. I stayed back about 50 feet off the woods, and I was throwing rocks. I was doing anything I could to hear a noise, and I don't know what I was doing. I honestly don't know what I was doing. I don't know what I was thinking. I don't know what I would have done, but it came time for me to go to work again. So I walked out to the Jeep, and that's when I saw on top of the Jeep was that apple, the big red apple sitting perfectly placed on the soft top of the Jeep. And I immediately turned around. I didn't even touch the Jeep. I turned around. I had my boss on the phone before I even hit the door, told him I wasn't coming in. I went upstairs. I packed my suitcase. I packed my son's suitcase. We loaded up, and we went to Indiana and stayed at this apartment that I had, because I'm in a band and most of my bandmates are up in Indiana. So I got an apartment so that, you know, we can all come together for shows and whatnot. But that's where we stayed for 6 months. And around the 1st of June, my family was able to convince me to come back. You know, my father's getting older. He can't do what I do around here. He can't cut logs no more. He can't haul them to the mill. He can't mow for a long amount of time. He can't fix fences. He can't tend to all these animals. He can't do what he used to. And I think with me leaving, he realized how much of that he depended on me for. And so he was able to convince me to come back. And so I got back here between, I would say, the 1st of June and the 10th of June, somewhere in there. And ever since I've been back, everything has been perfect again. You know, I can go into the backwoods. I can go into the backfield. I can go to the bowl. I can go past the bowl. Now, the first few days, I was really petrified still. Like the first couple nights, you know, I was unloading. I had brought some stuff back with me, so I was unloading a trailer and a U-Haul. You know, I'd bought a car while I was up there, and there was a lot of miscellaneous because I wound up shutting down that apartment up there. So all the furniture from that apartment. So I was unloading the U-Haul, and I was kind of on a time crunch. So I wound up getting here probably 9 o'clock at night. It was dark when I got here. So of course I'm just surrounded by this black woods. And the last time I saw this woods was when I saw that thing. So, yeah, the first couple nights, especially the first night, because I was carrying heavy things. There was a lot of moments where I had my back turned to the woods, but I was on a time crunch. I had to get that U-Haul back. So I was not going to get charged for that extra day. You know, I was already $600 deep on this U-Haul. Plus I'd gone over the miles, so I wasn't going to pick up that extra charge. So I took whatever flashlights I had. I've got a Jeep, I've got a truck, and I've got the car that I bought in Indiana. All three of them were around the U-Haul, facing out with their headlights on. And I was just unloading, and I was by myself, and I was petrified. And that's not a feeling that I'm used to feeling. I mean, there's nothing, be it the inner city, be it, you know, I've lived in some very rough places. I've lived in Atlanta, some parts of Denver. I lived in Yuma, Arizona, which is probably the worst place I've ever lived. But yeah, I'm not ever somebody who's afraid. And that feeling shook me to my core, and I was the most uncomfortable I'd ever been. But I got it all unloaded. The next night was rough as well because, I went out to burn trash, and that was rough. And then, like, the next day after that, I started mowing. The field had gotten pretty tall. Dad can't mow for a long time, like I said. So around the shed, where I mowed and weed eated, I saw the dents. The mower actually hit one of the rocks that I must have missed it and didn't throw it back into the woods, but the mower hit a rock, and, I was focused on the dents on the side of the shed, and when the mower made that sound, I about came out of that seat. I was shook. Every little noise, I was like a cat in a room full of rocking chairs. I was just on edge constantly. But I forced myself, after I got done mowing, the sun was about an hour from going down, I forced myself to walk through the first set of woods down to the creek, forced myself to walk up the other side, across the next field, and down. And the entire time, other than my mind running wild, scanning for this thing, I never had a bad feeling. And once I was able to I'm not going to say put that out of my mind, because I definitely, still cannot put that out of my mind. But once I was able to just, close my eyes and just feel, I didn't feel it there. It was not there. There was nothing there. It was the woods that it was the woods that I love. It was my heaven again. And since then, I have not felt anything unusual. The dogs are back to their normal routine of chasing armadillos. Last night, as well as tonight, I've been in the backfield, running armadillos, looking for coyotes, just back to normal. I can walk in the woods with a chainsaw. I can walk in the woods with headphones, and I don't feel anything. So, yeah, I don't know. Everything's normal, as far as normal gets.
I can only imagine what it must have been like unloading that truck all alone that night. Yeah, that must have been rough.
It definitely was, because there was, chairs that I was picking up, like a dining room table, big, awkward things, not necessarily, too heavy for me to lift, but it was things that, if anything was around, my main concern was not falling, so it was definitely not a good situation.
Oh, I'd say it wasn't. And if that dogman was around, yeah, obviously you were in a compromised position, so yeah, thank goodness you didn't have any trouble. Please describe the dogman you saw for us from top to bottom as accurately as you can.
Okay. He had pointed ears. They weren't super pointy. I mean, they were kind of like our dog ears. They were just a tad bit rounded at top. He was black as can be, but he had this gray marking on his chest. I keep saying he. I don't know if it was a male or female, but he had this gray marking on his chest. His shoulders, aside from his face, his shoulders are really what stuck out to me most. His shoulders and his chest was very broad, a lot wider than I am, a lot taller than I am. I'm about 6'2", $180, $185. This thing was, I can reach 8 feet, I would say. And I don't think if he was taller, he was not much taller than I could reach. So maybe 7, 8 feet, maybe 9, maybe high 6. I don't know. That was the furthest thing from mine. He was just bigger than I was. His snout was very pronounced in the moonlight. In the shadow he was casting out of my peripheral, I noticed the shadow that he was casting. and it looked. That's what I think made him look larger than life, was the amount of shadow behind this thing. His chest was very big, very wide. Arms were long, really long, and they weren't really down at his side. They were more kind of up-ish. His elbows were kind of bent. I did see his legs. I did see tail, but I saw that his feet were canine, but I didn't really look him up and down. I'm just going off of what I saw in my peripherals, and he was big. He was massive all over. His legs were big. His waist was a little bit smaller, but it was still big. I mean, his waist was still as wide as I am. And he just was big. He was really big. And the eyes were just so glowing, and they were like a yellow-orange color, and his pupils were so piercing. I mean, he was looking right through me. He wasn't looking at me. I felt like he was looking through me. That's just how sharp his gaze was. But it definitely wasn't anything I had ever expected to see. When I'd heard the rocks, I had maybe expected, like, at some point you might see a Bigfoot, but this was so far out of what I had ever expected. I had no reaction almost. It was dead still in that Jeep at that moment. His hands were not normal. They were long. He had very long fingers. There was just something about them that wasn't normal, but I didn't spend a whole lot of time looking at him.
Yeah, that's too much. Considering how he could have easily stayed out of sight that night, why do you think he made sure you saw him?
I don't know. I've put a little bit of thought towards this. At first, I didn't think that it was intentional, and I still kind of don't think it was intentional, because I had worked late that night, and it wasn't a normal time for me to be going down that road, and that's actually not even the way I take to work. I go to the left out of my driveway to go to work because there's a gas station down that way. And whenever I come home, I'm just focused on getting home, so I take the shorter route, which is to the right. And, he could have very well saw me the night before and the night before and the night before. He could have seen me at any time going home that way. But that's not a normal time that I was on that road, so half of me thinks that maybe I took him by surprise, or maybe he was waiting there for me. But the apple is what really makes me think that he could have been waiting for me. Like, he might have spent some time in the backwoods. Whenever I started feeling weird about the woods right behind the house, I wholeheartedly believe that that's because that's where he was. Maybe watching, maybe just figuring out our routines. I don't really know. I've not, when I went to Indiana, I started kind of doing some research, and I finally found out that this thing is called a Dogman. I was searching werewolf, I was searching all kinds of stuff, and then I came across Dogman, and, that's whenever I realized that they are pretty intelligent, so that could very well be what he was doing. I can't tell you why. If he was waiting for me, I can't tell you why he would be.
Well, there's no way to think for one of these things, so all we can do is guess, but it really does make you wonder why they do the things that they do. You had a problem with nightmares because of that experience. What more can you tell us about that?
Yes, that's true. I've had this reoccurring dream. I've had it 3 times. I mentioned earlier that I'm a father. My son just turned 3 on the 28th. In my dream, he's always in his bed, and his bed is in my room. But I always wake up to this creaking sound, and it's the door slowly creaking open, and then I see this thing's hand and his arm slowly go through the doorway, and it's completely black through the doorway, so I can just barely make out the outline, and then he rolls his hand over, and he's holding an apple. And my son sits up out of bed and starts walking towards the doorway to get the apple. And I try to call out to him, and I try to move towards him, but I can't. I can't move. I can't talk. I'm just like in a state of paralysis. I'm paralyzed, and I can't do anything. And he's just getting closer and closer to this thing, this arm in the doorway. And every time I have it, it's a little bit different. But it usually involves my son and this thing, obviously. And actually last night I had another dream, and at first I really didn't connect it. But it did kind of take a turn, and at one point I saw a face outside of the window, but the window and the upstairs is a good 20 feet up. So, it was most definitely a dream. There was no face outside my window, and I did wake up actually sweating, but, it's not something I like at all.
Well, I can understand why you wouldn't like it. Yeah, those are some pretty freaky sounding nightmares. Did you discover anything about yourself that you think you'd have to have a Dogman encounter to find out?
Actually, I think it led to more questions about myself. Before, I've always been, I call myself the alpha of the land. I run the show. The dogs won't listen to anybody else. I don't even have to speak. I look at the dogs, and they get right to. My son is very well mannered, very well behaved. Again, I never have to get on to him. I just give him a certain look, and he does exactly what he's supposed to do. And I've that way in business too. The business I'm in is kind of people oriented. And if you don't go in there and own the room, you don't own anything. So that's how I've carried myself for a long time. And I've always kind of thought about different scenarios, like, what if somebody broke into the house, or, what if this happened, or what if that happened? And in every one of those scenarios, I'm the man who shuts it down. But that night in my Jeep, I was far from that man. The weeks before in the woods, I was far from that man. I was shook. I was not the man. I was afraid. And that really has shaken me as to who I thought I was, and, who I really might be.
Well, let's look at the facts here. You were placed in a really difficult situation that would have shaken up the biggest, toughest person, so no, I think you deserve a lot of credit for handling it so well. But having said that, Trinity, it's about time for us to get out of here. Before we do you have any closing comments you'd like to share?
I actually don't. It's really strange how it just went from being so tense here to absolutely nothing here. No, the shift was just insane. The last time I was here, it was really intense, and then now I'm here and it's perfect, and I just don't, I can't explain it. But I don't know, that's not really a good closer, but, I don't know.
That's okay. It's really hard to put words to the feelings that you're having right now, so I totally understand, and I think those are good words. But having said that, Trinity, I want to thank you so much for coming on and sharing that experience with us. I really appreciate it.
Hey, thanks for having me, Vic.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks again so much. Have a great night. If you've had a Dogman encounter of your own and would like to speak with me, whether in private or on the show, please go to dogmanencounters.com and submit a report. I'd love to hear from you.